What you're about to see has never happened before inside a royal palace courtyard. Donald Trump, unannounced, uninvited, strode straight into the ceremonial grounds and demanded the palace keys, in front of tourists, in front of cameras, in front of a royal guard who didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't salute, didn't even look at him, until the former US president crossed one invisible line. And that's when the guard spoke, just one sentence, and left even Trump frozen in place. Now, before we show you exactly what was said, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments. Should a royal guard ever speak, even when protocol says no? Because what happens next proves that silence isn't weakness. It's the loudest thing in the world. There's a particular kind of April air in London, not quite spring, not quite cold, just brisk enough to sharpen the edges of sound. The Union Jack stirred lazily above the north wing of Buckingham Palace, and the gravel forecourt glittered faintly under a pale sky. A group of tourists leaned against the black railing, phones already up, their lenses trained on the grand wrought-iron gates, as a motorcade of black SUVs slipped through with unnerving silence. You could hear the shift, conversations dropping to whispers, a child asking, "Is it the king?" just as the lead vehicle pulled to a halt near the ceremonial arch. But it wasn't the king. The door opened and out stepped Donald J. Trump. He wore a navy topcoat over a pale suit, tie slightly loose, collar tugged. One hand immediately went up to adjust his lapel, the other already gesturing as he began walking forward. AD to the left, camera operator to the right. Secret Service trailing like nervous shadows. He paused on the gravel, squinting up at the facade of the palace. "Now that," he said, loudly enough for every staffer and every tourist within 50 meters to hear, "is some real estate." A few members of his team chuckled, unsure if they were meant to. The British staff at the courtyard edge didn't. Trump turned slowly, scanning the scene. "Would you look at this place? Whole thing's like a royal museum. You could build a hell of a golf course out back." His gaze stopped abruptly on a single figure standing beneath the stone archway that led to the side entrance. Warrant Officer Thomas Alden, Coldstream Guards. He stood like a sculpture, red tunic sharp against the limestone, bearskin cap casting shadow over an unreadable face, rifle upright, boots locked, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the horizon. Trump stepped closer. "Who's that?" he asked his aide, pointing. "Ceremonial guard, sir. One of the—" "No, I mean him. That one. What's he guarding exactly, and who's got the keys to this place?" The aide hesitated. "I believe that would be managed by the royal household." Trump waved him off. Yeah, I want the keys." There was a beat of silence, the kind that only really happens when someone says something so unexpected that even the birds seem to pause. "Let's have a look around. Get me the keys." He pointed again, this time directly at the guard. Warrant Officer Alden didn't move, didn't glance, didn't twitch. Trump smirked. "You soldier. Hand 'em over." A few tourists near the rope barriers blinked, unsure whether they were watching a joke or something very real beginning to unfold. The American president stood in the forecourt of Buckingham Palace, pointing at a ceremonial guard and demanding the keys to the building. And the guard? He didn't even blink. Most tourists assumed these men were for show, living mannequins in bright red tunics and tall black bearskin caps. Something for the postcards. A backdrop to make the palace feel more British. They didn't know what the uniform meant. They didn't know what it cost. Warrant Officer Thomas Alden had been standing at that archway since 0600. He'd arrived hours before the motorcade, hours before the first tourists, when the air still carried the bite of early morning dew. He'd checked the angle of his boots on the granite flagstones, reviewed the arm drill, stepped into his post with the precision of someone for whom every movement was muscle memory, burned in by time, by repetition, and by something deeper. Alden was 42, tall, lean, features worn sharp by desert wind and ceremonial silence alike. Before the tunic, before the bearskin, he'd worn desert fatigues and Kevlar. Helmand Province, Southern Afghanistan, 2009 to 2012. Convoy Overwatch, Perimeter Hold, Medical escort during an extraction op gone sideways near Nad Ali. He'd spent 6 hours holding a 30-metre corridor under enemy fire to make sure 5 injured soldiers made it onto the Chinook. 3 of them did. The citation called it Extraordinary Resolve Under Fire. He never mentioned it again. After his second tour, he transferred to ceremonial duty, not to escape the battlefield, but to stand somewhere where the rules still held, where silence meant something again, where orders were clear and history had weight. They'd assigned him to Buckingham, Coldstream Guards. His grandfather had worn the same unit badge during Korea. His father had never served, but his uncle had. The family had one of those old framed service photos. Alden now stood next to it on the mantel at his mum's house, same posture, same chin, just a different century. He never spoke while posted, not just because it was against regulation, but because it wasn't needed. His body spoke in stillness. And this morning, posted at the North Arch just outside the Queen's entrance, he had already stood through the courtyard cleaning, the first wave of school groups and the flag ceremony. He had maintained perfect formation through every shuffle, laugh, cough and careless selfie attempt from the rope line. And now a former US president was pointing at him, demanding keys. The absurdity of it wasn't lost on the British staff watching nearby, but none of them laughed. None of them even breathed loud. Because the request wasn't just incorrect, it was a violation, a fundamental misunderstanding of how this space works, of what the uniform meant, and who it served. Ceremonial guards don't carry keys. Not to side doors, not to anything. Access to royal residences is handled exclusively by designated personnel within the royal household or military police. Every movement is logged. Every access point is tracked. Every key, real or symbolic, has a chain of custody longer than most careers. But Trump didn't ask about that. He pointed, he gestured, and he expected the door to open. Alden, meanwhile, didn't react. His eyes remained focused beyond the former president, beyond the motorcade, beyond the crowd. That wasn't defiance, it was the job. The tourists didn't fully understand what they were seeing, not yet. But some of them were beginning to feel it, a shift in the air. That the man in red wasn't a prop, that this wasn't theatre, that the stillness in his stance wasn't blank obedience, it was history, discipline, and a line you didn't cross. Trump pointed again, more forcefully. I said, "Give me the keys." A few heads turned, but Alden stayed exactly where he was, unmoving, unbending. And as the weight of silence began to stretch across the courtyard, even those who didn't understand the rules knew they were watching someone who did. Trump didn't like to be ignored. He took a step forward, shoes crunching loudly on the gravel, the kind of sound that draws eyes, even when you're not the most recognizable man in the courtyard. "Hello?" he said, his voice rising now. "I'm giving you a direct instruction. I want the keys." The rope-line crowd, which had been watching half curious, half distracted, started to lean in. Phones lifted slightly. A few fingers hovered over record buttons, waiting to see whether this was a joke or a story unfolding in real time. Trump gestured broadly toward the palace facade. "Let's not play games. I've seen the inside of Mar-a-Lago and the White House. This place," he smirked, "I could have a golf simulator in every ballroom by Friday. Let's go. Open the door." His voice wasn't hostile, not yet. But it had that particular cadence, the performance voice, the one meant for cameras, for moments meant to be clipped and quoted. He pointed again. "Soldier, hand them over. Let's see what kind of security this place really has." A few chuckles rose from the back of the American press pack, not from the British staff. Near the Queen's entrance, a young palace steward in a navy overcoat stood frozen mid-step, clipboard pressed against her chest, watching. Her eyes darted toward the private security liaison, then toward the military attaché posted discreetly by the service gate. None of them moved. Because no one was quite sure what to do when a former head of state walks straight past diplomatic protocol and demands access to a royal residence from a ceremonial guard. Trump turned to one of his aides, a tall man with nervous energy and a headset mic. Why is he just standing there? This one even speak English? The aide cleared his throat. Sir, they're not permitted to engage. It's protocol, strict guidelines. Trump scoffed. Yeah, well, I'm not British. I don't play by their protocol. Then louder. This isn't respect. This is theatre. And I'm not in the audience. I'm the main event. The moment was teetering. Everyone could feel it. The air in the courtyard had thickened, not like before, with its ceremonial rhythm and quiet awe. Now it felt unsettled, like something was about to give. The camera operator on Trump's team, sensing the visual, adjusted position slightly to get Alden in frame, centered behind the president's shoulder. He zoomed in slowly. Trump stepped even closer, closing the distance to the edge of the ceremonial boundary. The space between them, 5 feet, 4, felt tighter than it should. Trump now stood well within the respect radius all visitors instinctively maintained around posted guards. You're being rude, you know that? He said. I asked for something simple. You stand there like a lamppost. A few American tourists laughed nervously. British ones didn't. By now, every phone on the rope line was up. Some pointed toward Trump, but most were angled toward Alden, toward the man in red who hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't even shifted his weight since the moment this all began. And for the first time, the laughter started to die. A girl in a denim jacket, no more than 10 years old, tugged at her mum's hand and asked, "Can he make the guard move?" Her mother's reply was quiet, careful, not without consequence. A few rows back, an older man with silver hair and a navy wool coat adjusted his scarf and murmured, just loud enough for those near him to hear. That one served. You can see it in the stance. Straight spine, balanced hips. Not a show pony. A soldier. One of the Secret Service agents standing beside the lead SUV tapped his earpiece twice, not because of a threat, but because of a frequency shift. A signal coming in from someone higher. He looked toward the palace entrance, then quickly back at Trump. Something about his posture said he wanted this moment to end. But Trump wasn't finished. He leaned forward just enough to let his voice carry. What are you going to do, statue? Blink at me? Scare me with a frown? I want the keys. The absurdity of the command was now fully eclipsed by the weight of the silence that followed it. And Alden? He remained still, rifle at rest, chin lifted, vision locked on a point far beyond the provocateur in front of him. It was no longer inaction. It was resistance, and everyone watching could feel it. Trump had now closed the distance to just a few feet. The crowd, once murmuring, had fallen completely quiet. All that remained was the scrape of a distant gull's cry above the east wing, and the steady pressure of a dozen phones recording from just beyond the rope line. I'm asking you again, Trump said, his tone flattening into something colder. I said, hand over the keys. Let's go. Still, Warrant Officer Alden didn't move, not a twitch. He stood there as if carved from the very stone beneath his boots. Boots that hadn't shifted since the confrontation began. His rifle rested exactly where regulation dictated, the polished steel bayonet catching the pale spring light. His bare-skin shadow cut a crisp line across the flagstone behind him. And his eyes, unreadable behind the slight angle of the cap, remained fixed forward, past Trump, past the cameras, past the performance. And that's when the power began to shift, not dramatically, not with gasps or applause, but subtly, quietly, like fog lifting from the minds of the crowd watching. Because something about the silence was heavier than the shouting. Something about the stillness was louder than the orders. A few of the tourists lowered their phones, not to stop recording, but because they no longer needed a screen to tell them what mattered. They were watching a man refuse to yield, not with fists, not with words, but with presence, with restraint, with the kind of discipline that makes an entire space pause. Trump was still talking, still gesturing, still throwing lines into the crowd like bait, but the bait wasn't landing. This guy doesn't blink, he said. Maybe he's trained not to, or maybe he just thinks he's above a little cooperation. No one laughed, because by now it was clear that Alden's stillness wasn't robotic. It was willful. And it wasn't just about protocol anymore, it was about a boundary, about a tradition that didn't bend just because someone demanded it loudly enough. Behind Trump, one of his Secret Service agents shifted his weight uncomfortably. The security team wasn't used to this kind of confrontation, not one where they couldn't step in, not one where the threat was a man standing perfectly still. To the side, a young palace staffer whispered something into a radio, possibly calling for protocol support, possibly just documenting the moment. A mother lifted her child onto her hip and quietly turned the little boy toward Alden. "Look at him," she whispered. "He's not angry. He's not rude. He's just not moving." Nearby, a Royal Navy veteran in a dark overcoat stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching with the faintest of nods. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. And still, Alden stood, unchanged. Trump now seemed to realize the crowd wasn't reacting the way he expected. The usual cycle, provoke, dominate, dismiss, wasn't working here. He tried another tack. "You think this is about you?" he said, his voice loud again. "It's not. It's about respect. I've been saluted by generals in 5 countries. They don't just stand there like they're made of wax. Nothing. Not from the crowd, not from the guard." The silence was starting to unnerve even his own team. His aide leaned in, murmuring something low and urgent, likely a suggestion to step away, to shift angles, to move toward the press area. Trump waved him off with irritation, but the energy had changed. He turned back to Alden, eyes narrowing. "You're not saluting because of politics, because of who I am." The words felt smaller now, like they were searching for traction in ground that no longer gave way. Still nothing. Not a blink, not a tremor. Just that perfect, unmoved line from boots to shoulder. The quiet defiance of someone who didn't need to win the moment, because he'd already claimed it by never yielding it. And in that moment, the courtyard wasn't Trump's anymore. It belonged to the man who refused to move. The side gate near the state entrance opened with a soft clink of metal. A figure emerged, upright, deliberate, and completely unhurried. Major Eleanor Grant, Royal Household, Ceremonial Division. Pressed navy uniform. Hair swept into a regulation bun. No medals, no flourish. Just the kind of posture that made people instinctively step out of the way. She walked with purpose, but not haste. Her tablet held flat against her hip, her heels clicking once for every 3 of Trump's pacing strides. She didn't interrupt immediately. She waited, assessed, let the space speak for itself. And then, without raising her voice, she stepped forward and addressed the most recognizable man in the courtyard. "Mr. Trump." Trump turned, blinking at her sudden appearance. "Yes? I'm Major Grant. I oversee ceremonial compliance for this forecourt and its personnel." Trump flashed the smile, the one meant for crowds, cameras, deals. "Perfect. Maybe you can tell this guy to lighten up." He gestured lazily toward Alden, still motionless behind him. "I asked for the keys." Just a quick look inside. No big deal. Her expression didn't flicker. "Respectfully, sir," she said, "that's not a request that can be granted. And the guard you're addressing is not permitted to respond in any form while on post." Trump squinted slightly, as if he hadn't quite heard correctly. "What, you mean he won't respond?" "There's a difference." "No, sir," she said evenly. "I mean he can't. It would violate military code and ceremonial law. That guard is fulfilling a standing post in service of the Crown. He does not answer to individual demands, no matter their origin." Trump exhaled sharply through his nose. "Even from someone who's done more for NATO defence budgets than half your parliament?" There was a beat. Grant gave a slight tilt of the head. "Especially then." The air didn't shift, it crystallized. A few of the tourists blinked, unsure if they'd just heard what they thought they'd heard. But there was no mistaking it. Trump cocked his head, smiling again. But the smile had lost its edge. It didn't reach the eyes. "Oh, come on," he said, voice rising slightly. "It's symbolic." "You people are all about symbols. What's more symbolic than letting a former ally peek behind the curtain?" Grant's voice remained level. "This isn't theatre, Mr. Trump. This is sovereign ground. The guard's presence here is not ornamental, it is constitutional. Ceremonial does not mean optional. He laughed once, short and dismissive. You're making a mountain out of a wax figure. She didn't respond. And in that silence, hers now, not Alden's, a new kind of authority entered the scene, not one built on volume or position, but on clarity, composure, boundary. Trump tried once more. So you're saying he serves the crown, not the people? Grant didn't blink. He serves the institution that outlasts politics. That's the point. That sentence landed, not like a punch, like a line drawn on marble. Trump stared at her for a long moment, his mouth half open, an argument forming but not quite reaching the surface. Behind him, Warrant Officer Alden hadn't moved once. Still as granite, still watching a horizon only he could see, Major Grant stood her ground, hands still at her sides, eyes calm, her very stillness a mirror of the man behind her, a different posture, but born of the same place. And for the first time, Trump didn't have a comeback. He just looked around and realized no one was laughing anymore. Trump's shoulders shifted. Not much, just enough for the wrinkle in his suit to tug across his back. His hand hovered near his hip, then clasped loosely behind him. The grin was gone now. Not replaced by anger, exactly, but something less rehearsed, something like discomfort. He turned back toward Alden. The guard still hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't twitched in the face of a public demand from one of the most powerful men on the planet. Trump tried again, softer this time. You're standing here like you're made of stone, he muttered, mostly to himself. You think that makes you strong? Still nothing. Trump narrowed his eyes. You can't even look at me. No response. And then, perhaps sensing one final opportunity to seize control of the moment, Trump leaned in slightly, just enough to make the tension crackle again. The crowd held its breath, cameras framed closer. Come on, he said, voice lowered but biting. One sentence. Just admit it. You're not allowed to open anything without permission, are you? Even the keys obey someone else. And that's when Alden moved. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just precisely. His right hand shifted along the stock of his rifle. No break in discipline, no violation of form. A formal repositioning, the kind that's written into manuals, drilled into muscle, refined by time. It was a movement that said, attention has been acknowledged, not by choice, but by duty. And then, still facing forward, eyes never wavering from that invisible ceremonial line beyond the palace gates, Warrant Officer Alden spoke. Just one sentence, firm, low, calm. These keys don't open doors for egos. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words landed like a bell rung inside glass. They echoed in the silence that followed, not because they were shouted, but because they were final. Trump's mouth froze mid-reply. No one in the crowd said a word. Phones trembled slightly in hands that were suddenly unsure whether they should still be recording. A child whispered something to her father, but even the whisper felt intrusive now. Alden didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. He returned his right hand to its regulation position, rifle secured, chin high, stance square. And just like that, he was motionless again. The crowd didn't cheer, they didn't gasp, they just absorbed it. Because something had shifted, not just the power in the courtyard, but the dignity in it. Trump stood there a second longer than he probably meant to, still, silent, searching for a counter that didn't exist. Because how do you respond to a man who only speaks when he knows it matters? He turned slightly, then all the way. And for the first time all afternoon, Donald J. Trump, the man who demanded the keys, had nothing left to say. Trump turned away, but the echo of Alden's words seemed to cling to him like static. He took 2 steps back, then 3, but his posture had changed. The shoulders weren't as square, the chin wasn't as lifted. He gestured vaguely to his aide, a half-hearted wave that said, "Get me out of this," but without saying anything at all. The aide moved quickly, eyes darting to Secret Service and then to the press. The entire American team, so confident minutes earlier, was now operating in a quieter rhythm, less strut, more strategy. No one wanted to be the next one called out, even silently. Trump turned one more time briefly toward Alden. No words, no gestures, just that lingering stare of someone not quite sure how he lost control of the room, but he had. Because the guard never broke, never yelled, never explained himself. He had delivered a single sentence, and in doing so, reminded everyone watching that not all power comes from volume. Some of it comes from presence. Major Grant was already speaking in a low voice to Trump's security detail, likely coordinating his return to the official reception area. The language was crisp, clipped, formal, not hostile, just done. The way British authority tends to handle moments like these, wrap it clean, move on, let the silence do the talking. The tourists didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They simply watched as Trump and his entourage retreated, as if unsure whether to keep recording or just stand there and take it in. And Alden, still unchanged. His right hand returned to rest on the rifle's grip, his boots perfectly aligned. His head held at the exact prescribed angle, as if none of it had happened. But it had, and everyone knew it. A small boy at the rope line looked up at his mum. Why did he say that about the keys? His mother crouched next to him, brushing his hair gently behind his ear. Because some people think shouting makes them important, but standing still can be louder. Just beside them, the Navy veteran who'd been watching earlier let out a slow breath. He wasn't smiling, just thoughtful, like something about that sentence had settled deep in his chest. "Didn't flinch," he murmured. "That's a soldier." A young American woman whispered to her friend, "That line, what was it? Something about egos?" The friend nodded. "Yeah, that's going viral, for sure." But no one was laughing, not now. Because what had started as a moment of mockery, a man demanding access, demanding attention, had ended with every eye in the courtyard trained on a figure in red who had never once tried to be the centre of anything, and yet had become it. Trump was almost to the motorcade when someone, likely a press officer, muttered into their comms unit. The message wasn't public, but the tone said everything. Keep the footage tight, no wide shots, avoid the guard. But it was too late. The moment had already happened. It had passed through everyone who witnessed it, settled into their bones in that way certain moments do, not loud enough to shake the earth, but clear enough to etch something permanent. Tradition had stood, and ego had stepped back. The black SUVs idled at the edge of the forecourt. One of Trump's aides opened the door. He paused, glanced once more over his shoulder. Still, Alden didn't move, and not for spectacle, not for provocation. Not for cameras or legacy or ego, and that's what unsettled him most. Not the silence itself, but the realization that it couldn't be controlled. Trump ducked into the vehicle without another word. The door shut with a quiet final click. The convoy rolled forward, gravel crunching beneath custom tires. Out the gate, into traffic, out of the moment. But the courtyard stayed behind, and the man in the red tunic, he was still holding it. The convoy slipped beyond the gates. Its presence, once loud and heavy, now faded into the late morning hum of London traffic. But in the courtyard, no one moved. Warrant Officer Alden stood in the same position he had occupied for the last 2 hours. Left boot slightly ahead of right. Chin lifted. Rifle held firm, but not tense. A figure that could have belonged to another century, but somehow made the present feel more real than anything else. The tourists lingered. They didn't speak, not because they didn't know what to say, but because they'd already witnessed everything they needed to. A few stepped back from the rope line, giving the guard more space, even though the barrier was already set. A man removed his hat. A woman lowered her phone. One father gently turned his teenage son by the shoulder and nodded toward Alden with a quiet, "Watch that." Not the confrontation, not the moment he spoke, but what he did after. He stood, as if none of it happened, as if nothing in the world had changed. But everyone watching knew better. A British staffer in uniform retrieved a clipboard she'd dropped earlier, her fingers moving slowly, careful not to break the silence. A junior attaché whispered to another, They'll talk about this for weeks. The other nodded and replied, he only said one sentence. That's all it took. And in the background, the other guards continued their rotations, clicking heels, sharp turns, polished rifles. Ceremony resumed, as it always does. But the people in that courtyard, tourists, staff, locals, even a few who had just wandered through Green Park for the view, had now seen something that would follow them home. Not a scandal, not a confrontation, but a moment where protocol held firm against performance, where tradition didn't yield, where a man in red, bound by duty and silence, reminded the world that not all strength needs a voice. The courtyard began to breathe again. But Alden, still as stone, and somehow more present than anyone else. What do you think? Should the guard have stayed silent, or said even more? And if you were standing there, would you have sided with Trump or the tradition? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story made you feel something, like subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss tomorrow's upload. Share this with someone who still believes silence has no power. Our other stories are already on your screen. Dive into one next and I'll see you there. Same time tomorrow with a brand new story that just might stop you in your tracks.